Hi, my name is Kason, and I want to thank you in advance for listening to my Imagineering project. I do want to issue a slight trigger warning before I begin, as this content gently engages topics of death, loss, and self harm. The idea that I have imagined for filling a gap in ecclesial spaces is what I like to call death chats. Death chats is a way for congregants to come together and engage in a non directive discussion about mortality and loss. In this presentation, I'm going to be covering why I believe that there needs to be death chats, what a death chat might entail, and how a church can plan its own death chat. Beginning with why, I believe that by and large, as a culture, we do not know how to constructively engage the concept of death. This can be pointed out in many ways, but I believe the best example to start out is the absence of death from the American secular calendar. Our holidays, our opportunities to all dwell on a shared thought, really completely ignore the concept of death. The major holidays like Valentine's, St. Patrick's Day, Christmas, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, and New Year's, none of these really engage with the topic of death. The three holidays that do are Halloween, President's Day, and Memorial Day. But really, Halloween is reduced to just the fanfare and the thrill of the celebrations. And President's Day and Memorial Day, rather than commemorating people we have lost in their public service, they're really just meant to be nationwide discounts. So, death is largely ignored on our calendar. Another place to look for this is also about death and film. Film has a unique way of checking the pulse on the state of a conversation that in its present state in our culture. And I believe regarding death, the Barbie movie does this well. The Barbie movie talks about this protagonist Barbie who grows up in a society with other Barbies, and it is just constant festivity and fanfare and fun. This Barbie looks around and notices that no one's aging and every day mostly looks the same. So at one party, she asks, "Do you guys ever think about dying?" And no one is really able to engage her concern because their society is built on ignoring the concept of death altogether. So, what happens when we actually try to address the elephant in the room? Well, other movies capture this, such as the recent Mario movie. In this Mario movie, Luigi and Luma are suspended over lava, and they're actually having to reckon with what they believe to be their impending doom. Luigi, who is the gentler of the Mario brothers, is actually really fearful of the experience of death. And the Luma, she develops a rather existential and almost suicidal attitude towards her own end. But now you may be thinking, as Christians, we don't really have to have these fears because we are guaranteed a life after death. Well, in a movie that came out this year called Mickey 17, a man signs up to be a test subject for different science experiments, and as a result, if he ever dies in one of these experiments, they can reprint his body and re-upload to that body his consciousness and memories, such that even when when he dies, he's promised life again. But one of the big parts of the movie is that he's actually still afraid of dying, even though he's died 16 times before this. It still distresses him. And his partner in the movie still mourns his loss every time he passes, even though she knows he's just going to be reprinted again. And so you may still be thinking, this isn't the type of resurrection life that Christians are promised. Well, I want to maybe make you think about this biblical example of Jesus in the garden. Jesus, who is the resurrection, Jesus, who is eternal life, he is even distressed when he is reckoning with his own death. But rather than running away from it, and rather than letting his fear overtake him, he engages this very critically in his prayer and conversation with the Father. In Matthew it says, he asks, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me." And then in Luke it says he prayed so anxiously that his sweat became like great drops of blood. And so maybe there is some legitimacy to the Christian experience of being afraid of death and needing to work through this concept of one's own mortality. Notice it was not until after Jesus reckoned with it in this way that he then surrendered himself over to the Pharisees and allowed himself to be put on trial so he can fulfill his purpose. So, as it turns out, critical engagement with the topics of mortality and loss has the potential to alleviate the fear of death, foster a healthy imagination of the afterlife, publicly acknowledge mourning and loss, confront our human limitations, collectively think about our pasts and futures, foster profound human connection, reflect on our ways of caregiving, and develop our theology of salvation. And my favorite, it helps us inspire creative new ways of approaching life. On the other hand, ignoring death's role in life can lead to a lack of preparation for one's own death, a lack of ability to engage with people having suicidal thoughts, emotional suppression when confronted with instances of mourning and loss, unaddressed aperophobia, and disorientation when confronted with the mortality of a loved one or oneself. And so I conjecture, in light of all this, that if reckoning with death is an important part of life, then churches should have the infrastructure to do so. Hence, death chats. So now that we know the importance of death chats, what would this death chat really look like? Well, fortunately, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, as an organization called Death Cafe has developed a model for non-directive discussion about death that has gained traction in the US since 2012. And I believe that adapting this model to fit a local ecclesial space would actually be very helpful. What this looks like is a certain run of show. The Death Chat's host will welcome participants to the event and invite them to share snacks and refreshments in lighthearted conversation. Once everyone is seated in a circle, the host will gather the room's attention, open with prayer, and pass the attention to the facilitator of the conversation. After this, the facilitator delivers an opening explanation of the occasion, then provides rules of compassionate conduct. The facilitator also introduces the triage caregiver as the touchstone if someone finds themselves distressed at any point. Once everyone expresses agreement with the rules, the conversation begins, and it proceeds according to the prompts, questions, and responses of the participants, because this is a non-directive discussion. As a result, control of the conversation's direction is shared. The facilitator only takes the control if the conversation spirals or gets stuck. The facilitator at the end will draw the conversation to a close and deliver a final benediction. At this point, the host re-extends snacks and refreshments, and the host lets folks know that the contact information of trusted therapeutic professionals will be shared in the event's follow-up email. This host may also express plans for a subsequent gathering if that is in the works. So, now that we have a run of show, how do we pull this together? The first step that a church needs to consider when planning a death chat is to find those three roles, the roles of host, facilitator, and triage caregiver. Because we have a referral list of professionals, these three roles themselves do not have to be licensed professionals. These three roles may simply draw from the skills and giftings and abilities and anointings of people who are already in the congregation. Once you have those three leaders, the next step is to get the word out. Share news of the death chat according to however your church usually announces events. Maybe you even extend word of mouth invites or post flyers around your building. The important part is that you gather a guest list. Because this is a small group setting, ideally you want a maximum of 15 people. But in the case that more people are interested, you may want to consider adding in a second session. The third step is to hold the run of show itself, and the fourth step to do after the event is to reflect and evaluate. Gather the experiences of the different participants and what they thought was helpful. And also the host, facilitator, and the caregiver can meet to reflect on potentially what needs to be improved if the church decides to do this event again. I hope that this presentation has given you a better idea as to why we need death chats and how they can fill a gap around our conversations about mortality in the church. The inspiration for this presentation was drawn from the sources listed on these pages.